Okay. Then we'll go ahead and go. Thank you very much. All right, it is 1:32, and we'll call the meeting of the Advisory Council on Workers' Compensation to order. It is Wednesday, October 11th at 1:30 p.m. In Legislative Plaza, Room 16 in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm obviously not Treasurer Lillard. He sends his apologies. He was unable to be here today, and he's asked me to serve in his stead. So, with that being said, Mr. Scroggs, would you call the roll?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Chairman Allen.
Here.
Mr. Dove. Here. Mr. Fox.
Here.
Mr. Garrett. And Mr. Garrett is out of town, I understand. Mr. Hunt also, I believe, is out of town. Mr. Pitts.
Here.
Mr. Schaefer.
Here.
So we have 4 of our voting members present, which constitutes a physical quorum. And then I'd like to call the non-voting members: Joy Baker, Jason Denton, Sandra Fletchall, Dr. Keith Graves, John Harris, Lynn Lawyer, Jerry Mayo, Dr. Merle, and Mr. Ramos we've heard from. Correct, Greg?
Yes.
Pam Smith. Our ex officio members, Senator Jack Johnson, Representative Jimmy Eldridge. We have, I believe, Ms. Hudgens is here. Yes. Administrator of the Bureau, Abby Hudgens, is here. And Mike Shinnick's designee is here. And Troy Haley. You have a physical quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Scroggs. Again, welcome, everyone. The next item on the agenda is approval of the minutes of the meeting on September 6th, 2017. Have the members all had an opportunity to review the minutes?
Yes.
Does anyone have any changes? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second? A second by Mr. Dove. All in favor, and this is just a voice vote, say aye.
Aye.
Motion passes and the minutes are approved. All right, the next 3 items on our agenda are receipt and consideration of the actuarial reports. So we will start with item 4A on the agenda, which is the actuarial review of the voluntary loss cost filing by Ncci, proposed to be effective March 1, 2018. And our first presentation is from Mary Jean King of By the Numbers Actuarial Consulting, or BINAC, which is the contracted actuary for the Advisory Council. Welcome, Ms. King.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if you
Having me here. Can you hear me?
if you'll pull that microphone towards you a little bit, make sure the green light is
better?
on. That's better.
All
Make
right.
sure to state your name for the record, and then the floor is yours.
My name is Mary Jean King. I'm here representing By the Numbers Actuarial Consulting, or BINAC as we refer to ourselves. Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to be reviewing the Ncci Workers' Comp Loss Cost filing effective March 1st, 2018. In September, Anne-Marie Smith presented the Ncci filing to the committee, and as you may recall, she reviewed the 5 areas, actually 4 this year, sorry, that contributed to the overall change of minus 12.6 presented in the filing and the process used to calculate the indication. First, data from the Ncci financial calls is developed to estimate the ultimate value of premium and losses. The historical data is adjusted to reflect the current approved loss cost level and statutory benefit level changes that have subsequently occurred. This change in experience had an impact of minus 11.1% in the Ncci filing, and BINAC's estimate of this change is minus 6.9%. And this is the largest area of difference of opinion between the Ncci filing and the BINAC report. Then trend factors are applied to account for expected inflationary changes between the historical loss experience and the time period during which the filing for the proposed loss costs. The NCCI, the impact of their trend factors is minus 1.9%, and for BINAC it's minus 1.7%, so very close. A provision for loss adjustment expense is included to account for defense cost and containment expenses, as well as adjusting and other expenses. The change in the LAE provision is minus 0.3% for NCCI and minus 0.1% for BINAC, again, very close. And then BINAC and NCCI are in agreement on the final adjustment, which is for the recently enacted benefit level changes. We really rely on NCCI to estimate those changes, and we are in agreement with their estimate. And I should say, everyone should have a copy of the presentation. All right. There we go. So I'm going to go over a comparison to prior estimates. This is something I did for the first time last year, and I'm going to do it again because I feel like this gets to the heart of the difference between the two reports and also the reason for the large decrease. The projected cost ratios, both on a BINAC and NCCI basis, and our selections. I'll also go over the loss adjustment expense just briefly because they were so close, but I just wanted to let you know why mine was slightly different, and our findings. So this is my first exhibit, and this graph shows a comparison of the estimated ultimate indemnity losses for the 5 most recent policy periods. I'm only showing part of the graph so that you can see the differences better. The paid is the blue estimates. So that's based on paid development. The green is the paid plus case. The darker is the more recent, and the lighter is the prior. And the black is the current selected, and the red line is the prior selected. So I'm just trying to see how we're doing compared to where we were last year when we were estimating these same losses. And I tried to put them on a consistent basis. And as you can see, this is very much what the indemnity losses looked like last year as well. The 3 older policy periods, the 4 estimates, both the 2 current, the 2 prior, and the paid plus case, they're all pretty close to each other, and there isn't a lot of difference. But the 2014 year, there's a big decrease, as there was last year. So the thing to keep in mind is that the NCCI selection is based on just the 2 most recent policy periods, so the 2014 and the 2015. So their estimate, they have a big decrease in their estimate, partly because of that change just in that 1 year. Can't get it to, there we go. So this is the medical. This is where things get interesting. Recently I was at an actuarial meeting, and the topic of discussion was how to best explain why incurred losses increase from period to period, especially in workers' comp. Usually you know about the claims pretty quickly, so a lot of times people don't understand why there's changes. And the suggestion was to say, well, you know, imagine you're the claims adjuster and you know about the claim and you're taking all the information you have about the claim and you're coming up with what you think is the perfect reserve for that claim. And then the phone rings. And what's happening? You've got new information. Is it good news or is it bad news? Typically it's bad news. The claimant has not responded to the treatment that you recommended. Your reserve is going up. Or they want to try something new, it's more expensive, your reserve goes up. I'm here to tell you that in Tennessee, a lot of claims adjusters must have been getting a lot of good phone calls, because for the 2nd year in a row, the medical losses from first report to 2nd report, the paid plus case losses for the whole state of Tennessee decreased. That is very unusual. Before last year, I had not seen that in Tennessee in the 15 years of data that I had available. And now it's happened a 2nd year in a row. we're looking at policy year losses at first report. So that's on the very last day that a claim can occur. So you have to think, there's at least a few true IBNR claims that have been occurred but not reported. And also there's claims that you don't really know as much about right at that point in time. And yet 12 months later, the estimate went down. Last year, NCCI investigated that further, and they were able to say, there were 3 large losses that really had large decreases, and that's what accounts for the decrease. This year, they did not see that. This year, it was more widespread, that they're, more like a possible true trend. So that's what led to the decrease in that 2014 year, which you can see is substantial. It's partly that the losses went down, and partly that the loss development factor also went down. Both, I think all 3 of the actuaries chose an average excluding the high and the low, but now that average includes a number that's below 1. So the loss development factor for that period decreased, but it was not just that 12 to 24 month period. It was also the 3 prior periods had much bigger decreases than we saw last year. That's partly, and the average decrease was 5% over all 4 of those periods. So last year I was saying to you, let's include those older years because they're more stable. And now those older years too are pretty volatile. So that's one thing. The other thing is, as we're seeing these decreases in the actual experience, our loss development factors are going down. So there is somewhat of a compounding effect that I at least am beginning to feel concerned about. But this is really the heart of the recommended decrease, which all 3 actuaries were in agreement that the recommendation is a decrease. Yes.
You said you're beginning to have some concern about the overall trend looking at the last 5 years. I just wondered if you could amplify on that a little bit so we could understand.
Well, I guess my concern would be that you both the losses have gone down and our loss development factor has gone down. And if what is actually happening is that there's going to be similar development, but it's taking place at different points in time. So now instead of taking place from 12 to 24, maybe it's going to take place further out on the tail. We don't have actual experience for that yet. And there's not a lot we can do about it other than say, maybe there's reason for caution. But it could be that, as I said, it's not known still. So it could be that truly there's been a change in the medical loss development for Tennessee. But I guess what I feel the reason that I want to use a longer experience period is because it has a moderating effect on the recommendation. Did that answer? Yeah. I'm obviously not pointing it at the best place. There we go. All right. The projected cost ratios. So the green bars are BINAC's estimates. Each of these, we looked at 5 years. Each of these is a projected cost ratio for the upcoming period. So they've all been, it's as if we said, what if the claims that happened in that prior period happened in the upcoming period? What would they cost? And what would be the indication for the rates based on those claims? And as you can see, from 2012 to 2015, there's pretty steady decrease in that projected cost. And so this year, when making our selection, BINAC selected a 4-year average. So the selected for BINAC is the orange 0.920. And I feel like this, as I said, sort of balances responding to the trend that we are seeing of decreases and acknowledging that we think that a decrease is necessary, but also moderating it slightly by looking at those prior years and the projected cost ratio using those. The NCCI is the blue bar, 0.877, and that's based on a 2-year average, 2014-2015, of the NCCI indications. So the BINAC indications are slightly different just because there's some small differences in the selection of the loss development factors and also the trend. All right, I wanted to go over quickly why the loss adjustment expense selection for BINAC was slightly different than NCCI's. Once again, the developed countrywide DCCE ratios from NCCI were consistent, which was good. This is the second year we've seen that. So the changes that they have made in their methodology, I think, have been effective. So I have no arguments with the countrywide developed DCCE ratio. How they get the Tennessee ratio is they use a relativity. The relativity is based on paid loss to paid DCCE ratios. And there they use actual Tennessee experience and actual countrywide experience. And if you look at those paid to paid ratios, you can see Tennessee 0.119, 0.118 the last 4 years. It's been very consistent. The countrywide, on the other hand, has been increasing. And I felt like the relativity went down mostly because the developed DCCE ratio didn't increase in the same way that those paid-to-paid ratios. I wasn't sure that that decrease in the relativity was necessarily true. And so I selected the 0.127, which was the Tennessee ratio from last year, because I just don't think, looking at those paid-to-paid ratios, that there has been much change. But this has a very small effect on the indication. So what are my findings? The proposed change of minus 12.6% effective March 1st, 18 has been reasonably calculated in accordance with actuarial standards of practice. Everything that I'm describing to you are just differences in opinion, but I do believe that the NCCI filing has been reasonably calculated. I do think that the volatility that we're seeing in the estimated ultimate selections compared to the prior analysis supports the use of a longer experience period. And so once again, I would recommend a 4-year average instead of a 2-year average. The NCCI trend factors were 0.945 for indemnity and 0.980 for medical. BINAC was very similar, just slightly different indemnity, 0.950 and 0.980. The LAE for NCCI is 19.7. For BINAC, 20.0. Again, a small change. And overall, the NCCI indication was minus 12.6%, and BINAC was minus 8.1%.
Thank you, Ms. King. Are there any questions from anyone on the council for Ms. King? No one here. Anyone on the phone have any questions? I don't hear any. So, Ms. King, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda is the actuarial review of the voluntary loss cost filing by NCCI, with a presentation by Chris Burkhalter of Bickerstaff, Watley, Ryan, and Burkhalter, the actuary for the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance. So please come forward, sit down. When you're ready, state your name for the record, and we'll get going with your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm Chris Burkhalter with the firm of Bickerstaff, Watley, Ryan, and Burkhalter. As she said, we do rate reviews and for the Tennessee Department all year. This is our major effort in reviewing the NCCI filing each year. This is my 4th presentation to the council, and it's been an interesting ride so far. Since 2014, your loss costs right now, before we do anything here, sit at about 21% lower than my first presentation. And if the NCCI recommendations are approved, that will become about a 31%, quite remarkable. I will end the way I start here in saying that we find NCCI's analysis to be reasonably calculated, as Mary Jean stated, in accordance with all applicable standards. Every difference we have is a matter of actuarial judgment, so please keep that in mind as we proceed. Our major areas of review are similar to those in prior years. You'll notice a strike through on the LAE provision. This year we found no material difference in our own analysis. There had been some what we call residual development of some of those statistics that caused us to deviate from those, but it never was a big effect. So that one's stricken this year, and we're going to concentrate on loss development, the loss ratio trends, and the experience period. Ms. King mentioned in her presentation the remarkable downward shift in loss development. This is just one graph that I decided to throw up to show you kind of the magnitude of it. What we're looking at here is that 12 to 24 month interval of medical losses. This is paid plus the case reserves that the insurance companies put on top of that. So to give you some idea of what you're looking at here, if you look at the 2009 year where it says 8.2%, what that means is that all policies written in 2009, if you just took all of their medical losses paid in case at the end of that policy period, and then looked at them again the next year, they grew 8.2%. Okay, then if you go forward in time to policies that were written in 2010, it was 5.8. You can see the remarkable downward trend, and then we bottomed out in policy year 2013 at a minus 4.5. Now that year did have, according to NCCI, they did dig into those data sets, and that did have several unusual claims with certain carriers and certain circumstances that caused them to change their selections of loss development going forward. But the fact that there's a minus 1.4 in 2014, that has no similar characteristics. That is just a general overall industry negative loss development. And as Ms. King said, that's quite remarkable. We don't see that very much. Now, we can conjecture, what that is. If you think about it, 2013 was obviously a year of great reform, and so perhaps some of the claim adjusters might not be taking that into account in the individual claim files, and that might be what we're seeing. If that's the case, then it might be that we expect that kind of to flesh out and then go back to a new high after that. That might take a few years to do. But clearly, the loss development is something that is really pushing the indications downward, because even when you're looking at trend points, those are all based on the severity side. Those are all based on actuarial estimation. So if the loss development on all those years goes down, it shifts the whole curve. So that's why it's such an important factor here. And when you're seeing things that low, that really drives the difference here. We use a 5-year average on paid loss development factors, which is our main difference from NCCI, not a 2-year, and that adds about 1% additional rate on top of their indication. Moving on to the trends. First of all, trends in claim frequency. This should be a beautiful graph for everybody. Not everybody likes rate decreases. Not many people like rate increases on the other side. Everybody can stand on opposite sides of decisions. But this graph, unless you're just an evil person, you should like. Because this basically means that less people are getting hurt, people are having to pay less. That'll benefit everybody eventually. And this really is a remarkable slide. You have a 5-year fall of frequency of 28.5%. So, when I started with the fact that you're at 21% down on loss cost level from a few years ago, this is a huge part of it. A 1-year fall, you see that last point, that red point on the right, really drops off. That's a 9% decrease in one policy period. So that's pretty remarkable, and it's not just randomly hopping around. You see the correlation there, and that 5-year trend is 98.8%. It's been a really smooth ride down guess it'd be a black diamond slope if you were in Colorado. It's been quite a drop. And this really, this is probably one of the main drivers of what we're seeing year to year, all these negative indications. If we go over to severity, we split this into
Mr.
indemnity
Pitts,
and
hang on just a second. Mr.
Yes.
Pitts, do you have a question? You're recognized.
What was the percentage you used to what the frequency drop had been? Did you say 25%?
That we use? Well, we select basically a cost ratio trend. So when we select, it's marrying frequency and severity. But in the previous graph, the drop from 2010 to 2015 is about 28.5% down, and then the drop from 2014 to 2015, the 1 year drop is 8.9%.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so we look at indemnity and medical severity separately, and this is a remarkable graph. This is one, it's going down, and usually you don't see that. Indemnity is better behaved than medical in terms of upward cost pressures because it is so tied to statutory benefits, and so it tends to be limited. Medical can rage a little more as medical providers find ways to code things differently and increase reimbursement. But indemnity is a little more tied to the law, so it tends to behave better. But a downward trend is, in my experience, somewhat unusual. A countrywide trend on indemnity is upward. All around you, Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky, they're all showing their modest upward trends, but they're upward. And here you'll see you have a long-term trend of minus 3.0. That's pretty nice, and a 5-year trend of a minus 3.2. So this is another cost driver that's going in the right direction in terms of loss cost. Yes.
Mr. Fox, you're recognized.
Is this downward trend related to legislative changes that capped indemnity for return to work injuries? It was at return to work at 2.5 times the impairment rating. It dropped to 1.5 times the impairment rating. Is that what it accounts for?
Well, most of these are put kind of on benefit level, so that those are already kind of cooked in. But there tends to be some residual trend that it can't just be mathematically, calculated claim to claim. So the answer is kind of yes and no. NCCI does a really good job of any time those changes are implemented of reflecting that in their analysis. But I think there can be some things, like I mentioned on the medical, where the claim adjusters might not be reflecting it as rigorously as the actuaries and NCCI do. So there might be some residual effects there, but a lot of it is already cooked in.
Thank you.
The other thing I would, before going away here, is that last year when I put this graph up, that 2014 point that you see kind of sticking down below the green and the blue, that little red point, was actually an uptick when we were here last year. So my comment was, well, the downward trend in indemnity severity might be reversing. We'll keep an eye on that. Well, you can see now it's back down. That's loss development again. It's so another indication of how important that loss development is, that all of these graphs, the farther right you go on these graphs, there's more actuarial estimation. And it takes a while for that right part of the graph to set in concrete over time. Okay, medical severity is next. And this is an upward trend, but it is remarkably flat. The medical trend countrywide is a little under 5% year over year over the same period here. And you see this has hopped around and it's dropped off significantly after 2009. It has now scooted back up, but even that 5-year trend is really only at a 1.5%. So you just don't have anything that's really pushing your loss cost indication in the northward direction. Everything's kind of pointed in the same direction, and that's downward. So here are the projected cost ratios for NCCI. If we just use policy year 2014, NCCI would come in with a 10.9 decrease. Just 2015, it'd be a 13.8, and then their average is 12.6, as has been stated. To remind you, we use 5 years, and that's quite a long time, especially for a big book. We taper that down in our weighting. This is a matter of actuarial judgment. And so what we do is apply a 30% weight to the most recent policy year. So it's 30, 25, 20, 15, and 10. And that adds up to 100. I checked right before the meeting just to make sure. Weighted average there, then you see the downward trend 2012 to 2015 is stark. But when you weight it like that, that's when we get the minus 8.7%. And so in conclusion, then here's the differences. Loss development. We use 5-year average for everything, where NCCI has used a 2-year average on the paid, and that's like I said, about a 1% difference in our indication. We used to diverge from them in terms of tail factors. I won't even go into that, but then that's another area where we've adopted those without adjustment. The trends are very similar. We used the -2 on medical, as did NCCI. Our indemnity was a little tempered at a -5 versus a -5.5. Our LAE this year, we used theirs without adjustment, and then you see the weightings of the experience period, resulting in an overall indication of -8.7 to their -12.6. Last year there was a 12.8, and ours was a -8.7. So we're very consistent, just randomly. So, are there any questions?
Any questions from members of the council for Mr. Burkhalter? Anyone on the phone have any questions?
No, thanks.
I don't think I hear any questions, so thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Madam
Burkhalter.
Chairman. Thank you all.
The next item on the agenda is a response and comment on behalf of NCCI with a presentation by Anne-Marie Smith, Director and Actuary of NCCI Actuarial and Economic Services. So, Ms. Smith, whenever you're ready. So if you'll state your name for the record, we'll get started when you're ready.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Anne-Marie Smith. I'm a director and actuary with the National Council on Compensation Insurance, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk today. We'll be talking through both the loss cost filing and the assigned risk rate filing that were made at the end of August. As you've heard a couple of times today already, the primary reason for the proposed change in the voluntary loss costs is that we've seen favorable experience in the most recent 2 policy years, 2014 and 2015. In addition, we've seen some improvement in the development factors, which are the values that help us predict from the data that's being reported to us now what we think the ultimate value of those losses is going to be. And we've also seen improvements in claim frequency that are outpacing any changes in indemnity and medical severity. So those are the main drivers of the loss cost proposed change. With respect to the assigned risk rate change, the factor to convert our loss cost to assigned risk rates is actually pretty stable from last year to this year, from 1.7 to 1.709. And that's primarily due to the fact that we're proposing to increase the assigned risk differential and decrease the expense provision, and they're pretty much offsetting each other. So we'll talk about all of these things in more detail. First of all, you'll see I broke out here the change in experience and the change in development. As we look at the components, as has been mentioned a couple of times today, it's not only the values that are getting reported to us, which is the change in experience, but also the development factors that are driving part of the decrease that we're seeing in the state. Again, the decrease in trend selections is dropping the indication almost 2 points, and then some minor changes in the LAE and the benefits. So you've seen the 5 policy years proposed a couple of times today already, and yes, the 2014 and 2015 are the ones that we use in our experience period. We believe that the most recent 2 policy years is responsive to what's going on in the current environment, and Tennessee is a large state, so it has enough stability without bringing in the older policy years. When we look at the experience, one question that often comes up is what kind of large losses do you see in these underlying values? So on the next page, you will see a description of our large loss claim activity. So what you're looking at here is we collect a separate financial call just for large losses, and that's defined as any losses where claims are over $500,000 in indemnity and medical pay plus case. So we get individual claim detail reported for each of those. And so here you're seeing a summary of the most recent 5 policy years as they were reported to us last year and as they were reported to us this year. And you can see that in the older years, fairly stable. You would expect from one valuation to the next for the numbers to change somewhat. For policy year 2013, you see about a $10 million increase. But keep in mind that that's caused by 2 different things. As I mentioned, the call only collects claim data for losses over $500,000. So any claim that was previously under $500,000 that just gets over the threshold suddenly looks like a new claim. So if something developed from $490,000 one year to $510,000 the next year, it looks like a brand new claim and over $500,000. So the change you see in 2013 is really about 50-50 between development on existing large claims and new claims that just appeared on the call. What should really stand out, though, is 2014 is one of the lower years that you see here, and it really didn't develop too much. So you've seen on a couple of slides earlier today that 2014 stood out as not having a large development factor, even having negative development. Part of this is driven by the fact that it looks like it was a good year, and it hasn't been developing upward as much as one might think looking at older years. So that's one thing that stands out here. And then you can see for 2015, even though we're seeing a very good experience indication for 2015, there are some large losses that we're already seeing at this report. So again, development's been mentioned a couple of times today, and I'll just take a minute to describe what you're looking at because I know it's a lot of numbers and bars on the page. So for 2015, the most recent year on the financial calls, that's reported at a first report. And so we multiply whatever losses we're looking at times that first to ultimate development factor. We do this for indemnity paid, medical paid, and all the pay plus case. So that first indemnity paid value of 2.35 is the value that we would multiply indemnity paid losses by to estimate what we think they're ultimately going to be. So the chart on the left shows you all the values that would be applied to the policy year 2015 reported losses this year, along with what we would have applied to the first report last year. And then the second chart that you see is the second to ultimate, so that's what would be applied for 2014. The big picture here is definitely that they're all decreasing, but they're all decreasing slightly. So it's not like it's just indemnity or it's just medical or it's just paid or just pay plus case. It's really happening across the board in little increments from prior valuation. So this gives us comfort knowing that what we're seeing across the board. It's not one particular thing driving it. So for the next couple of slides, we'll talk about trend. As was mentioned earlier, we do look at frequency and severity separately, but ultimately what we pick is our loss ratio trend factor. So here we're trying to estimate how much the indemnity losses related to premium will change between the data that we have reported versus when policies are going to be in effect. So these are the indemnity loss ratios, again, a 15-year history. And what we do is we see what each of those values are for the most recent 15 years, but we look at different averages. What are the most recent 5 years telling us? What are the most recent 8 years and up to 15? Last year's indemnity trend selection and the selection chosen by the 2 actuaries you've spoken today was negative 5%. This year, that negative 5% isn't in the range anymore of all the averages that we look at. So we found it appropriate to lower the indication or the indicated trends from negative 5 to negative 5.5 so that we could remain within the range. And this is close to both the 12-year and the 15-year average. With respect to medical, again, it's a downward trend over time, not quite as significant as indemnity, But again, the underlying values for both of these are the decreases in frequency that you've seen. So if frequency is a big driver, it's going to drive both your indemnity and your medical loss ratio trend. So last year, our trend selection was negative 1.5%. Again, when you look at all the averages you see on the page here, that would be out of the range of anything that we would be looking at. So we found it appropriate to lower the selected loss ratio trend here to negative 2. On the next couple of slides, I'll just go through the LAE provision. The first, if you recall, when we're figuring out the proposed loss adjustment expense provision in Tennessee, we start with a look at what's going on a countrywide basis, and then we look at a relativity between Tennessee and the countrywide values. So this slide just shows you the countrywide loss adjustment expense over the past 5 accident years for last valuation and this valuation. And the two takeaway here are really that for the most recent 5 accident years, the LAE provision's been pretty stable. And when you compare what our estimate was last year versus this year, they're pretty stable. So across the board, the countrywide LAE has been pretty consistent. When we're deriving the Tennessee provision, we look at the LAE in pieces. So we split that adjustment expense into defense cost and containment as well as LAE. For the DCCE portion, as you've heard already today, we take a relativity of the Tennessee paid to paid loss ratios over the countrywide. And this relativity has gone down over time. And on an earlier slide, you saw essentially what's happening is Tennessee is staying stable in the ratio of paid DCCE to paid losses, but on a countrywide basis, their overall values are going up. So you would expect that Tennessee's relativity would go down if you're staying stable while the countrywide average is increasing. So that's what we're reflecting here with the 0.929, which then generates your DCCE provision of 12.4, applied with the countrywide AOE provision of 7.3 to get at the final LAE proposed at 19.7. So that was the voluntary loss costs indication. I'll pause here before going on to the assigned risk rates to see if there are any questions about any of those.
Go ahead.
Okay. So moving on to assigned risk rates. So as I mentioned earlier, we start with the voluntary loss costs, and then we multiply those values on an individual class code basis by what's called the factor to convert to generate that assigned risk rate. And what we're doing, the loss costs only reflect a provision for losses and any expenses that we expect to move with losses. But for the assigned risk rate, we need the additional dollars for the expenses. We need to reflect the fact that the experience in the assigned risk market isn't as favorable as we see in the voluntary market. And that's all included in this one factor to convert. So when we're calculating it, we use these pieces of assigned risk differential, which is the piece that reflects the experience differences between the two markets. Then the voluntary expense provision is something that we remove because then we incorporate the assigned risk expense provision. And then finally, we use an uncollectible premium provision. So those are the 4 components that we need. When we're talking about the loss cost differential, what we mean here is we're taking that loss ratio that we see on a statewide basis, losses over premium, and we're comparing it to this loss ratio that we see in the assigned risk market. Generally, you would expect the loss ratios in the assigned risk market to be worse than what we see on a statewide market, and we want the differential to help capture this appropriately so that the assigned risk rate is an appropriate value. So on slide 15, you'll see the latest 10-year history of the assigned risk loss cost differential calculation. Column 2 shows the amount of premium for each of the individual policy years, and it's on a standard pure premium basis. Columns 3 and 4 show you the loss ratios in each of the market, and then the final column shows you the ratio between the two. So if you look at policy year 2015, that 1.508 that you see in column 5 is just essentially saying that when you divide the 1.08 by the 0.17, you get the 1.5, meaning that assigned risk loss ratio is 50% higher than what you see in the statewide market. So we look at that, and we do take a look at the 10-year average and see where it puts us. But one thing you also want to keep in mind with the assigned risk market is that the size of the assigned risk market can greatly influence what kind of ratios you're seeing. If you look at policy years 2009, 8, and 2010, the premium there is around that $11, $12 million mark. And if you move all the way over to the final column, you'll see that the ratios there are 1.7, even over 2.0. So there, what's happening is as the assigned risk market gets smaller, you're kind of left with the worst of the worst in the market. So you would expect that experience to comparatively be worse than what we typically see. When you look at more recent years with the premium now upwards around $28, $30 million, the ratio isn't quite as high. So it's something that you need to keep in mind. We don't like to just take a straight 10-year average and use it without applying some sort of judgment. But that being said, on the next slide, you'll see the calculation done with the 10-year average as a starting point for our analysis. So in row 1, you'll see the 1.591 from the previous slide. Then we also include any premium that can be generated by assigned risk programs that are in place. So in Tennessee, we have the assigned risk adjustment program, and that's estimated to generate about 8.7% of premium. So we already know we're getting that premium in the assigned risk market. We don't need that to come from the differential. So we adjust for that, and that leaves us with row 3, indicated differential of about 1.464. But again, that value's kind of driven upwards by those years where the market was kind of small. So we want to select something a little lower than that that's more appropriate for the size of the market now. So last year's assigned risk differential was 1.25. The indicated was around 1.46. So we're proposing 1.35. So that's the differential. Again, the permissible loss ratio is how we account for the assigned risk expenses. And here you can see the different components. The servicing carrier allowance is the percentage that they're paid to service the claims. The premium tax, we calculate an average provision, and then we have an estimated assigned risk administrative expense. So all those generate the expenses. In general, this expense provision is lower than what we saw last year because we are no longer accounting for the premium discount program, as those were removed. That program was removed from the assigned risk market last year. And then finally, the last provision is the uncollectible premium provision. In the assigned risk market, you wouldn't expect that all the premium will ultimately be collected, but when we get the data reported to us, it is reported gross of those uncollectibles. So we need to account for some provision to account for the uncollectible premium that won't be collected. So in prior filings, 3.2% was used as the amount estimated for uncollectible premium. We are still collecting data. As you know, we just became the administrator in 2015, so we're still collecting more data on the collectible premium provision. So for now, we're holding that 3.2 in place. So here on slide 19, you can see a comparison of the factor to convert from last year to this year. The first piece is that differential, which again, we're proposing a 10-point increase from 1.25 to 1.35. The second line is just reflecting the fact that the LAE at the voluntary basis last year and this year. And then in row 3, you'll see that permissible loss ratio, and again, that's where the expense provision changed. So the changes in row 1 and row 3 are kind of washing each other out, which is why ultimately at the bottom it's a very small change in the factor to convert. And this generates a 0.5% increase in the assigned risk factor to convert. So that means that the indicated change for the assigned risk market is negative 12.2%.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Are there any comments or questions from members of the council? Anybody on the phone have any questions? Hearing none, thank you, Ms. Smith, for your presentation.
Thank you.
At this point, the agenda calls for us to open the floor for discussion of the 3 presentations you've heard today and for the council to consider making a recommendation concerning the voluntary loss cost filing to the Commissioner of Commerce and Insurance. So we will open the floor for discussion. Is any member of the council? So do any members of the council have a motion relative to the voluntary loss cost filing?
We can all charge ahead. They don't have to wait on me.
So the floor is open for discussion, motion, anything the council wishes to do after having heard the presentations today. Mr. Pitts is recognized.
The lady that was last up here, would you mind coming back for a question?
Ms. Smith, please come back up.
I'm going to shock her. This is not even going to embarrass her.
Go ahead.
I think the advisory council finds itself in somewhat of a unique position. I think I've been around since the beginning, and this may be right before the arc, I think. This may be the first time that we've had our actuaries, not NCCI, come in and recommend giving a smaller reduction than is being proposed by NCCI. I am correct in that belief, I believe.
No, sir. All 4 years we recommended smaller reductions than NCCI.
Oh, so you're consistent. Oh, no problem.
As are we.
I said that I think this is the first time that all of the actuaries came in at a smaller amount. But anyway, I stand corrected on that if I'm wrong. If I could halfway layman summarize what I think you've said, is you're working on the 2-year average, which obviously NCCI appears to be comfortable with. And when we look at your trends, most all of them seem to be in a negative posture. So would it be fair for me to assess that you all are totally comfortable with your recommendation going forward for the next year? That's my first question.
Yes, I am totally comfortable with my recommendation for next year.
Since there's always been a lot of discussion about whether the 2-year or a 4 or 5 year average is most appropriate, could you offer any comment as to what you have to see occurring in data in subsequent years to make you want to leave the 2-year average? Just a curiosity question, if you understand. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Not exactly. So you're saying?
I'm saying right now you all like the 2 years.
Correct.
Is there a set of circumstances in data in the future that would make you want to desert 2 years and go to something longer?
So I know a few years ago when the experience period was discussed heavily, part of it was because the experience within those 2 policy years was telling 2 very different stories. I think the indications themselves were, they're not consistent with each other. And the order at that time from the commissioner, I believe, was to always consider a longer experience period when there was volatility in the experience period that we currently use. So when I see the most recent 2 policy years essentially telling us the exact same thing, and if you think back to in August, I even tried to peel it out between not just the 2 years, but if we use just paid, if we use just paid plus case, all of those were telling us double digits or more. So if we saw 2014 and 2015 telling us very different things, one's a positive, one's a negative, or one's -5, one's -20, then maybe we would have to take a look at something longer. But right now, when the most recent experience is telling us the exact same thing, I don't see the need to go further back. And I will say that if you look back to the slides on each of the other presentations where both actuaries were kind of illustrating our selection compared to the 5 years and their selection compared to the 5 years, both of the selections that were ultimately made in by the two other consulting actuaries, because they were using that longer experience period, ended up with indications higher than both of the most recent 2 years. So to me, now those indications are tempering it to the point where you're not reflecting what you're seeing in the most recent data, and that would give me pause.
Is that not further supported by the fact that there's either 4 or 5 years of downward trend, and the figure you all have picked is an average, which is still higher than, I believe, 2015?
Can you repeat? Sorry, I was half listening to the other conversation on the phone.
Well, it may not be relevant, but my point was that when you look at the data, loss data shows a downward trend for, I believe, 5 years.
Correct.
And then when you average the last 2, it turns out that the figure you came up with is still higher, I believe, than 2015.
It's an average of 2014 and 2015. So with 2015 being lower, it's in between the two. My point before was that the average being recommended.
Well, I may have said it wrong, but
Yeah.
my point is it's still higher than the most recent year.
Most recent 1 year.
1 year. That's my point.
Okay. But the original question was...
I'm trying to work with you and be nice
I'm
and
trying
be
to
helpful, and I haven't said anything bad yet.
Nope.
I think that's pretty sound logic, personally, and I guess I want to pause and ask if anybody else has a question they want to ask prior to a motion.
Any other members of the council have any questions or comments for Ms. Smith or for each other at the moment? I see none. Mr. Pitts, do you have a motion?
Well, I'll float it out for what it's worth. I would recommend that the advisory council go on record in its transmission to the commissioner that we're in support of the NCCI recommendation.
For the motion, is there a second?
I would second.
Mr. Fox seconds. Is there discussion on the motion? Seeing none. If you're ready to vote on the motion, Mr. Scroggs, would you call the roll?
Mr. Dove. Mr. Fox. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Shaver. The ayes have it.
And the chair would note that the chair does not vote on this matter as it is a substantive matter of the council. So the motion passes. So the recommendation will be made to the Commissioner of Commerce and Insurance, and Mr. Scroggs will put that in a letter that will go forth shortly. Thank you, Ms. Smith. Is there any further business to come before the council today? One second. Mr. Scroggs, did you have? Oh, that's right. I think Mr. Scroggs has a very short FYI for the council.
Just wanted everybody to be aware of the Form SD2 in your folder, which reflects the changes recommended by the Advisory Council to the Bureau of Workers' Compensation. Appreciate everybody's efforts on that.
Thank you very much for taking that into account. Okay, is there any further business to come before the council today? All right, seeing none, the council is adjourned, subject to the call of the chair. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you to those on the phone.